This event is entitled Iran's Struggle for the Middle East and the Shifting Paradigms in the Age of the Coronavirus. So as many of you know, Iran and the Middle East in general is quite in a state of turmoil. And Iran, in addition to pursuing its nuclear weapons program, is one of the main proponents and sort of a spreader of anti-Semitism around the world. The anti-Semitism of the Iranian revolutionary regime is a core element of its ideology, and it's a core element of its policy, and it has been since the time of the revolution. And in this moment, we'll hear from two eminent experts and authors and researchers on Iran and the Middle East. And for those of you who are following the Middle East and the turmoil between the Shiite and Sunni world, the role of Iran, the role of Turkey, the civil war in Syria and Iraq, and the migration crisis entering into Turkey through Europe, you'll know that Iran has always been sort of spreading the virus and the hatred of anti-Semitism around the world. It's a key element of their foreign policy. And in this moment of this sort of global crisis regarding the pandemic that's shut down the world economy and has made people very uneasy and frightened, Iran is taking this opportunity to really spread conspiracy theories, old anti-Semitic tropes, and conspiracy theories of blaming Israel, blaming the Jewish people, and using anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that came out of Europe over the centuries and has been widespread in Europe. So this is, in the Middle East. So this is a very important issue. So I think in addition to Iran's nuclear weapons program, I would argue that the traction that anti-Semitism is getting globally is a significant threat, not just to Israel and the Jewish people, to our communities in the diaspora, but it's really a threat to democratic principles and basic notions of citizenship. And as the center has been coming under attack, the political democratic center of societies have been coming under attack by political Islam. And as a reaction to it, I think white nationalism and racism, it's beginning to emerge in North America and Europe, and also the sort of the radical left, the perception of Israel and Zionism among the liberal intellectuals of the West, and the sort of the red-green alliance that many scholars in anti-Semitism have been exploring are very important and pertinent for this time of great marginalization and fear. So today we have two incredible authors and writers and analysts working with us. Joining us today to speak, the first person who will speak is Benny Weinthal, and also we have Seth Frantzman. So Benny is a research fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, or the FDD. He's a widely published journalist, and he's based in both Berlin and Jerusalem. He's also a prolific writer and journalist. He works at the Jerusalem Post. He focuses a lot of work on issues of anti-Semitism around the world, and also focusing on the Iranian revolutionary regime. It's sort of associates of Hezbollah and other supporters that are based in Europe and looking at issues of terror financing in Europe by Iran and Hezbollah. And he's also looked at the Islamic State in Europe and how that contributes to anti-Semitism and also growing neo-Nazism. Benny has, in addition to being based at the Jerusalem Post, he writes regularly in the Wall Street Journal, in Slate magazine. He's written in The Guardian, The New Republic, The Weekly Standard, and other very important newspapers, prominent newspapers in Germany. And I'll just mention, I think Seth is joining us momentarily. Seth Frantzman, who was born in the United States. He has a bachelor's degree from Arizona and a PhD from Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he just came out with a very important book that you may want to note and perhaps look for. He just published a book entitled After ISIS, America, Iran, and the Struggle for the Middle East, and Geffen Publishing has just produced it. He's written for the Defense News. He's written op-eds. He's the current op-ed editor and the Middle East affairs analyst for the Jerusalem Post, and he's contributed to the National Interest. He's covered the war against the Islamic State, traveling the region. He's covered the 3 wars in Gaza. He covered the Ukrainian conflict and the refugee crisis in Eastern Europe, and also reported directly from Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, Senegal, the United Arab Emirates, Ukraine, Russia, and many other parts of the world. So it'll be a treat to have these 2 great analysts of our time to join us. So Benny, if you can please start. And what we're going to do, the format for today, I think because of the, at one level, Zoom, we get to have many more people listen to us and watch us and join the conversation. We'll have a Q&A after Benny is finished. And we're going to keep the comments to about 7 or 8 minutes, because I think people are a little more distracted than in the seminar room. We have all these emails and all kinds of distractions on our computer, so it's difficult to focus. So we'll have 7 or 8 minutes introduction by Benny to the subject, and then Seth will follow, and then we'll have a Q&A and a conversation. So Benny, please take the floor, and thank you for joining us.
Okay, thanks for having me. Hello, everybody. Currently speaking from Berlin, Germany. And I'd like to thank Charles Small and ISGAP for the terrifically impressive work they do on studying and analyzing and combating anti-Semitism across the world. And I'd like to also thank Ira Guberman, who helped to organize this call for ISGAP and his important work. I'll just start, since we're talking about Iran's struggle for the Middle East and the shifting paradigms in the age of the coronavirus. That's the name of this talk. With the Islamic Republic and anti-Semitism, since this virtual call is being sponsored by ISGAP. Iran is without question the leading state sponsor of Holocaust denial and lethal anti-Semitism. In January, at a congressional hearing, the head of the ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt, also noted the role of Iran in being the leading international sponsor of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. The United States governments, both under the Obama and Trump administrations, have classified Iran's regime as the leading state sponsor of terrorism. So we're dealing with a very, very deadly regime in Tehran over the last 41 years. Now, in terms of the coronavirus and Iran, there have been a number of, as Charles alluded to, wildly anti-Semitic conspiracy theories propagated by Tehran. There's a very good article I'd like to recommend for folks on the website of Iran Wire. It's iranwire.com. On the blog section, there's an article that takes a very deep dive into this. It's called Battling COVID, Iran Regime Makes Jews Its Bogeyman, and it's written by a friend of mine, David Andrew Weinberg, who's now with the ADL, and the ADL's Shea Lerner. And David and Shia point out a lot of what many of you who follow this topic have read in the online, in the media, Iran's anti-Semitism right now. For example, the supreme leader, and I'm just quoting, I'll pick out a few, cherry pick a few really unsavory quotes from Iran's supreme leader's website, Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. Open quote: "There's no doubt that the Jews, and especially the Zionists, previously have a long history of supernatural affairs, and as matters such as a relationship with the devil and genies. And Israel's spy agencies also undoubtedly take advantage of these matters in terms of the coronavirus situation." The official Islamic Republic of Iran broadcasting website has also showed a clip where one of the clerics in Iran said the Jews are experts in sorcery and in creating relationships with demons. And Israel wanted to use demonic forces to infiltrate the intelligence systems of Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. And there's other quotes, which I can go on, where different the regime's propaganda apparatus accuses Israel, Zionists, and Jews of biological warfare, using the coronavirus, quote, as a biological, ethnic weapon that was, quote, created by Americans in the Zionist regime. And you can see on this that there's a running list of these types of comments from Iran's regime, not only from the supreme leader, but political representatives and its English language websites. For example, Iran's English language Press TV warned recently, open quote, "Don't be surprised that the recent corona phenomenon has a new world order fingerprint, similar to what it called the Zionist neocon false flag events of 9/11 2001, to help a self-serving psychopathic elite to achieve a one world government." So, you know, this very hardcore, aggressive anti-Semitism is surfacing right now, and one can, you know, read about it on this website, among others. Now, I think that gives one a flavor of the ongoing anti-Semitism emanating from this regime. In terms of Iran's role in the Middle East, I've got only a few more minutes. It plays a major destabilizing factor also within the coronavirus period. Iran has launched attacks against American and British military personnel. Earlier, just recently, killing 2 American military personnel and a British soldier. Iran is continuing to fund its malign activities, whether in Yemen or in Syria. And Iran's destructive activities, even within its own country, is a topic where I've focused a lot on. There are competing numbers right now about how many people have died in Iran. Iran is the epicenter right now of the coronavirus in the Middle East. Yesterday, I published an article based on a member of Iran's task force to combat coronavirus, who said that 500,000 people in Iran are currently infected with the virus. Now, the Iranian regime claims there are about 60,500 people, but a person on their export task force to fight the deadly disease says 500,000. And there have been other numbers out there from independent news organizations like Radio Farda that argue the number of deaths is significantly higher than what we're reading in or what the numbers are telling us in Iran. One story I can mention that a German daily published the other day is that there are, according to Western security sources, over 10,000 dead Iranians because of the virus. The regime says the death toll is nearing 4,000 as of today. So what you see right now is Iran's regime falsifying data, including the head of its judiciary, who, according to Western security sources, based on this German news article that I also reported on, are saying that deaths are now being attributed to heart ailments or pneumonia and not to the coronavirus. So Iran is engaged in a massive cover-up, even in the Middle East, that could potentially endanger Europe and international security, because they cannot rope in the coronavirus, and they're using false or defective methods. And this played out because the Iranian regime, as I mentioned, is more focused on promoting terrorism across the Middle East region than dealing with the health needs of their population. Now, there's a lot of information going out right now about, well, the Iranians deserve sanctions relief. From my perspective, and I've written an analysis on this, there seems to be no compelling argument that they need sanctions relief, because they have enough capital, hundreds of billions of dollars, where they could pump that money into alleviating their medical crisis. And there's a long document I should note, because I don't have time to go onto this, on the website of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. If you go to fdd.org, it's called "Should the United States Lift Sanctions on Iran to Address its Coronavirus Outbreak?" I would encourage folks to take a look at that article on the website of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. It's highly exhaustive, and it takes a deep delve into this whole sanctions dispute and whether Iran deserves relief, largely because apologists for the Islamic Republic of Iran and those and those opponents of sanctions are running a very high intensity campaign right now calling for sanctions relief, when if you look at Iran's behavior, Iran has in fact used humanitarian and medical aid over the years to fund terrorism or corrupt schemes to make money. The bottom line is, based on the analysis that FTD has done and based on my research, Iran has without question enough funds to combat the disease. It's just a question of whether they're going to prioritize their own population over jingoism in the Middle East. I'll end here because I see I only have about a minute left, to note that the coronavirus and Iran's anti-Semitism, to revisit the opening of my abbreviated talk, I think they're interconnected because Iran frequently shifts the blame, as Iran observers know, to outside parties for their own failures and their own inadequacies. And of course, turning Israel, the United States, into human punching bags to shift blame and attention away from the leadership of Iran. That's Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, Hassan Rouhani, the president, and Mohammad Zarif, the foreign minister, is a tried and true method of Iran seeking to continue to codify its power through these, I think, diversionary methods. And of course, Iran has sadly, the regime cornered the market on anti-Semitism and is using anti-Semitism as a way to avoid confronting its role in spreading the virus, the regime that is, because Iran continued to push for a lot of air traffic between China and Iran at a time when that air traffic should have stopped to curtail the virus. And Iran's response was very, very late in terms of reacting to the virus. So I'll end there, and I thank you, and I welcome any questions. As I've mentioned before, good questions are better than good answers.
So Benny, thank you very much. I appreciate your comments. Could you do me a favor? Could you lower the camera a little bit, because part of your face seems to be, yeah, better. Now we can see you. Good. So I'm going to ask a few questions and start a conversation with you. Unfortunately, Seth will not be able to join us. Something just happened at the last minute, so it's too bad. We'll bring Seth back another time. Yeah, that's better. Good. Thanks, Benny. So I'm going to ask you a few questions following up on your comments, and then we can open it up for Q&A. A few people have actually been sending in comments. There's one question. Somebody was asking if you can please, the websites that you mentioned 2 websites in your comments. Could you please give out the URL? Some people want to check it out and they've been asking, they can't find it online. Could you?
Yeah, so I can add the, let's see, I'll just go to the websites and I can add that in on the chat, right?
Yeah, or you can do it later.
Sure.
Or as I ask you the question. So you mentioned that there's, and I've been reading in the media and in some think tanks, there's been a discussion whether there should be sanctions relief for Iran. That's sort of become a conversation in the last week or so. Do you know who's driving that conversation? Why is that becoming an issue at this moment?
Okay. Just so you know, I sent the first link, and I'll send over the second link on anti-Semitism on the blog on Iran Wire. I just sent over the FTD analysis. The memo.
I can share it to all the attendees.
Okay, you received it?
Yeah, we did it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, there was a call yesterday with different former EU leaders, the former head of the European Union, the former foreign policy head of the European Union, and along with some other American officials, former diplomats, urged in a letter or a statement, I should say, based on this conference call they held yesterday, that the United States government should lift its sanctions targeting Iran. So that call also took place with an EU or a trade organization that I've written about that promotes, according to critics, sanctions busting seminars in Europe to circumvent U.S. sanctions. Richard Grenell, the acting director of national intelligence for the United States government and the current ambassador to Germany, actually told me, and I can also submit the URL to this article, that this group that is pushing for sanctions to be lifted should be sanctioned because of their work in Europe. But to back up, the United States government, for folks who are watching this, as folks know, withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018, the so-called Iran nuclear deal, because according to the Trump administration, the deal as negotiated by the Obama administration did not stop Iran's path to building a nuclear weapons device. It also did not stop Iran's international terrorism and its Iran's, when I say Iran, I mean the Iranian regime, Iran's illegal ballistic missiles program. Those are the reasons, and in response to that, sanctions were reintroduced targeting Iran, including very important oil sanctions, sanctions targeting Iran's energy sector that has caused considerable pain to the regime. And people now, the anti-sanctions advocates want those sanctions released. However, there is currently, since February, a so-called humanitarian channel in place that's operated by the Swiss government that allows Iran to receive all medical and humanitarian aid via this channel. There's also a European-run system called Instex that's just transferred roughly $500,000 worth of German medical technology to Iran, which could have gone through, I suppose, the Swiss channel, but the Europeans set up this separate mechanism that needs to be monitored because that mechanism could lead to sanctions. And it's very troubling what the Europeans are doing. But the main point is there's a Swiss mechanism in place since February that can handle all this aid. The groups that are trying to put pressure or trying to influence a change in the Trump administration are also the same advocates who want the nuclear deal, the defective nuclear deal, to stay in place from 2015. So critics would say these advocates are, many of them are engaged in a form of Saudi appeasement toward Iran's clerical regime, and they're not taking the business, of fighting anti-Semitism seriously. They're not taking the business of Iran's widespread violation of human rights within the country, and all the running list of horrors that I also cited in terms of Iran's activities in Yemen and Syria.
Okay, so Benny, you mentioned that Iran is facing a lot of internal difficulties. I think before the coronavirus, there were a lot of the opposition seemed to be gaining strength within the society, within the borders of Iran, for various interests and for various reasons. So could you comment on the stability of the regime given the threat that coronavirus poses, and the fact that I think many people in opposition political parties and ethnic groups see the regime as lying to them? I think that kind of notion is spreading around Iran, that people are not trusting the regime on how they're reporting and handling the virus. So can you speak, how's that affecting stability? And also there's a question that kind of dovetail into my question from Luciano Dondero, who asks, do you think, given the instability now in Iran, that the regime in a sense, would go for broke and launch an attack on Israel, given the situation? Are they in a more precarious situation and they're going to try to defend their regime?
Well, let me start with the question about whether the coronavirus could could undercut the regime's power. I think that's a really interesting point, Charles, and I don't think there's been enough research or enough writing about that. I saw an article today in the New York Times, or it might have been yesterday, excuse me, an op-ed asking, will there be a second Arab Spring or series of Arab revolts that we saw in 2011? But this writer did not address, could there be another Iranian upheaval like the Green Revolution that we saw in 2009, where there were hundreds of thousands of Iranians protesting the fraudulent presidential election, or even the revolts that we saw, mini revolts spread across Iran in November, protesting the rise of gas prices, as well as the actual legitimacy of the regime. So this pandemic brings into focus the legitimacy of governance deficits of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and whether the regime can survive. And I guess those questions, of course, will be answered, after the pandemic's over. I think, given that there is, at least based on, many commentators on Iran who have, decades more experience than me covering Iran and having been immersed in the country and lived there, say that the Iranian population, which is a very young population, holds the regime in total contempt. So there's intense loathing of this regime from large swaths of the population who are very distrustful. Masih Ali Nayad, who's famous for protesting, the Iranian dissident, lives in New York, who's famous for protesting the compulsory headscarf practice in Iran. There was an interview with her with a Canadian today on YouTube. I can also send over that video where she talked about how many Iranians are mocking the clerics and how the clerics are handling the coronavirus, and this sense of that this regime really has no legitimacy among, as I mentioned, large swaths of the population. So I think we'll see what happens post-pandemic, after many Iranians see the disconnect between what the regime was saying and the actual practice, because it's the deceptions of the regime are widespread at this point in terms of the fabrications about how many people have died, how many people are infected, how the regime is actually coping with the disease, why they haven't used hundreds of billions of dollars that they have available, the regime to aid the population, instead are creating a phony sanctions argument that they need the U.S. to release or lift sanctions in order to help Iranians. But as we know from history, this is not a regime that is terribly concerned about its population. It murders Iranians just for the mere fact that they exercise their right to protest on the streets. Now, the question you asked, or sorry, one of the listeners asked about an Iran strike. Can you just repeat that?
Yeah, he was asking whether, given the instability in Iran and the various economic, social, and political crises it's been facing recently, and now with the coronavirus, if they are so unstable, do you think there's a possibility that they would lash out against Israel or do something extraordinary in terms of its international conflicts that it's engaged in? Would it sort of ramp it up?
I mean, as you know, the Israeli military establishment has a phrase that Israel is in the midst of a war between wars. And I think with Iran, Iran has not only declared war on Israel, but it's also declared war on the United States since 1979. So Iran has been waging terrorism against Israel for decades, not only in the Middle East, but across Europe. Its support of its chief proxy, Hezbollah. For the Europeans on the call, I think that question was from somebody in Italy. Iran and Hezbollah jointly conducted an operation to blow up an Israeli tour bus in Burgas, Bulgaria in 2012, which killed 5 Israelis, injured 32 more, and murdered their Bulgarian Muslim bus driver. That was a joint Iran-Hezbollah operation. Now the question is, because there's increased stability because of the pandemic, and whether that'll cause Iran to lash out. I mean, we see Iran lashing out right now via its militias in Iraq, attacking, as I mentioned earlier, via its militias in Iraq. These are militias that are controlled by Iran. Also, Hezbollah is active. These militias have murdered British and American military personnel. Iran is also active in Syria and Lebanon on the north of Israel. So it's entirely possible that Iran, for whatever reason, could use a certain pretext to start a more intense war with Israel. As I said, because Iran's been waging war against Israel for decades via terrorism across the globe, and sending, as folks on the program probably know, drones into Israeli airspace, financing Hezbollah's missiles that were sent into Israeli territory during the Second War of Lebanon in 2006. And Iran has also helped finance Hezbollah with its roughly 150,000 rockets in the north, in the south of Lebanon, that are aimed at Israel. So these are all, we have a deadly series of ingredients that could propel Iran to push, perhaps, for example, Hezbollah to attack Israel again, or promote its ally in the Gaza Strip, the Hamas, the jihadi organization that Iran also aids. So you can see the breadth of Iran's terrorism activities across the region, and it's just a shame that European leaders haven't internalized how utterly dangerous this regime is.
Thanks, Benny. So I just noticed there's quite an amazing group of people are listening to us. Some community leaders, scholars, kind of active people. So please feel free to ask questions. I'm receiving your questions. I'll be happy to pose them. And if Ira's capable, I think he could be, actually, for some of you, I believe you can open your camera. We're new at this, so Ira, if we're getting some good questions, you may want to invite people to ask their own questions. So in light of what you said, Benny, the fact that Iran is supporting Hezbollah, and I'll just say that I've been reading reports. Rabbi Cooper said that you should smile. Thank you, Rabbi Cooper. Bring some light to this.
Rabbi Cooper from the Simon Wiesenthal Center instructs me to smile. I smile.
There you go. I was reading in some reports recently, in the last 24 hours, the Israeli security forces, particularly in military intelligence, is now putting Iran as their #1 priority as opposed to the coronavirus, which is interesting. That's been reported in the last 24 hours. So in light of
Charles,
Iran,
excuse me, you mean the Israeli government has shifted to make the coronavirus the #1 priority?
No. As of the last 24 hours, Iran is back to number one.
Oh, okay, that's it, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in light of Iran's support of Hamas and Hezbollah and the 150,000 rockets in Lebanon, I know, Benny, you've been monitoring and doing important research on Hezbollah's activities in Europe. How would you assess Iran's and Hezbollah's impact on anti-Semitic tropes? So I was speaking to Joel Kotek, a professor in Belgium, and one of our scholars on the summer program, and he's an amazing historian of the history of anti-Semitism in Europe. And he's looking at how every time there's a pandemic or an epidemic in Europe, there's often, if not always, a backlash against the Jewish community. So given this sort of precarious moment that the world finds itself in, people not sure where they're going to be able to find their paychecks, rent checks, people are concerned. What is the impact or the traction that Iran and Hezbollah is getting in terms of anti-Semitic propaganda at this very sensitive moment? Do you think that they're a main driver of anti-Semitism in Europe? Do you think that this could have an impact at a level that we're not familiar with in our lifetime, or how do you read the situation?
Right. I should just note I sent over the IranWire.com link, so participants can, I guess you'll send that over, can access that link and read about Iran's anti-Semitism during the coronavirus period, this very detailed list of examples. I think within Europe, of course, Iran and Hezbollah have a very active presence. Only 2 countries within Europe thus far have outlawed all of Hezbollah, the Netherlands and the United Kingdom last year. The Netherlands, I think in 2000, almost 16 years ago, roughly. So the Netherlands was, the Holland was way ahead of the curve. But the rest of the EU has not outlawed all of Hezbollah. They make this bogus distinction, which a lot of people know, between the political and the military wing, saying, well, the military wing we've outlawed in 2013, but we want to have contact with the so-called political wing. Hezbollah, all of its major leaders have declared the organization to be a monolithic entity. So this whole distinction is nonsense. If the European Union or a member state, as I mentioned, each country can unilaterally classify Hezbollah as a terrorist entity, that would help stop a lot of the anti-Semitism, because Hezbollah, for example, in Germany, its members frequently show up at anti-Israeli demonstrations where they raise funds, they recruit new members. They actually, according to German intelligence reports, send money to Beirut, to the mother organization in Beirut. And that money, of course, is used for terrorism. And that means building more rockets to kill as many Israelis as possible. Hezbollah also is one of the main organizers of the Al-Quds rally in Berlin each year. This is a Iranian regime created worldwide rally to call for the destruction of Israel. It's called the Al-Quds Day rally to reclaim Jerusalem. Al-Quds, people probably know, means Jerusalem in Arabic. So again, you have Hezbollah members doing all these sort of groundwork and organizational work to create a march through the heart of Berlin in the main shopping district with that attracts a sort of a deadly cocktail of, or a dangerous cocktail of radicals and neo-Nazis, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine members, that's an EU-US designated terrorist organization, Hezbollah members, and radical Islamists of all different stripes. This rally takes place, and also BDS activists, those who support the boycott campaign targeting Israel. So you could effectively take the sting out of a lot of anti-Semitism in the heart of Berlin, which is supposed to be a very tolerant city, according to the mayor, by eliminating Hezbollah, that is classifying it as a terrorist organization. There are 250 Hezbollah members in Berlin. I suspect the number is significantly higher. That's based on an intelligence report. There are 1,050 Hezbollah members across Germany. The numbers, as I mentioned, is significantly higher. And you've got scores of Hezbollah mosques, community centers, where terrorism is actively promoted. I've reported on this. If anybody wants articles, I'm willing to send them over. Where one Hezbollah center in Munster last year, a Hezbollah member openly declared, we're proud of our terrorism. The German authorities did zero. So you have a again, anti-Semitism is fundamentally at its core an eliminatory ideology that wants to obliterate Jews. And if you view anti-Semitism in these terms, and I think we have to, because of the lethal anti-Semitism that Europe's experienced in France and Belgium, with terrorism attacks in Germany last Yom Kippur, right? There was an attempt to create a bloodbath in a synagogue in Halle in the former East Germany. Then if that's your definition of anti-Semitism, or if that's how you understand anti-Semitism, that at its core, you're dealing with a deadly ideology that wants to turn theory into practice, then you need to use counterterrorism methods and focus on the most dangerous entities promoting anti-Semitism in Europe. That, of course, is just not Hezbollah. There's also Sunni-based jihadi groups across Europe, Islamic State members, Al-Qaeda. I can go on and on, different. But the Shiite jihadi organizations have received significantly less attention. And I think that also has to do with trade, because the Germans and other Europeans want to trade with Iran, oil business, all sorts of other business deals are at stake. And the Europeans don't want to pick a fight with Hezbollah, Iran's chief proxy, because that could jeopardize trade. I think that also plays a role.
Thanks, Benny. So how do you understand the reluctance of the German government and other European governments to deal with and imprison or expel or confront this domestic problem, which is, as you say, I think needs to be understood in terms of counterterrorism. But beyond that, Germany and other European countries have very strict laws regarding anti-Semitism, and yet here we have people spreading the tropes of anti-Semitism, spreading anti-Semitism and anti-democratic ideologies in Europe, and engaging in support of various kinds for social movements and organizations that are their mission is to get rid of Israel and exterminate Jews. How in 2020 in Germany, in Europe, given the history of anti-Semitism, can this group of people be tolerated?
Right. Well, I should also mention, and I omitted another very important development over the last few years, the important sense of how dangerous Iran is. A Pakistani agent working for Iran's regime, for the Quds Force, its expeditionary terrorist arm, which was sanctioned by the U.S. government as a terrorist entity, was convicted of spying on Jews, Israelis, and Israeli and Jewish institutions, and convicted and imprisoned a number of years ago. He was also, and this was not stressed enough, I believe, in German media report. There was a couple of reports that said he planned an assassination attempt. He not only spied on Jews and Israelis in Germany, but also in France. So you have the Iranian state, the Islamic Republic of Iran, sponsoring and paying a agent to surveil Jews and Israelis across Europe, including plotting an assassination attempt. And there was hardly any, there were no consequences for Iran except for the then German foreign minister to tell them not to do it again. So no diplomats were expelled. The embassy was not shut. Germany did not recall its ambassador. It's an amazing show of, I think, hyper appeasement when you see that type of behavior from Germany and the EU, because it sends a message to Iran that you can continue with your with your deadly activities across Europe, and you won't face much of a punishment. And we've seen that with Iran.
But Benny, why this tolerance?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, I think there's a combination of reasons. I think one is the Europeans, especially the Germans, are in the business of appeasement, and simply do not want to pick a fight with Iran because they don't want Iran to abandon the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So if the Germans and the Europeans apply pressure on Iran, Iran will abandon the deal, and Europe will lose its prized nuclear deal that's incredibly weak and filled with loopholes. But more importantly, it allows the Europeans to continue to trade eventually with Iran when the so-called deal runs out. Now that Germany is a special case, I think, because Germany's political foreign policy has largely been grounded in what I call a policy of miscongeniality. Germany's social democratic foreign minister does not want to pick fights with countries, except for Israel and the US. For whatever reason, Germany likes to pick fights with America and Israel, but authoritarian countries like China, communist China, Iran, Putin's Russia, somehow are insulated from tough criticism from Chancellor Merkel's administration. Now, other people in Germany think, well, I'll name one famous authority on German anti-Semitism, Henrik Broder. Henrik Broder is the leading expert on German anti-Semitism. He's a writer for Die Welt, the German newspaper. He's written scores of books on anti-Semitism, and he used to write for Der Spiegel. He's argued that, and this is a very controversial thesis, Henrik Broder's argued that Germans want to vicariously live through the lethal anti-Semitism of Iran's regime, and the Merkel administration, or the government, wants Iran to in fact finish the job of the Holocaust. And that's why Merkel and so much of German society placates Iran's regime. That there's actually a well-intentioned will, so to speak, to defer this form of genocidal anti-Semitism to Iran and allow them, as I said, according to Henrik Broder, to finish the job of the Shoah and wipe Israel off the map. Now, is there evidence for that? Well, you can certainly argue there's Germany's government does not understand, does not want to understand Iranian anti-Semitism, or understands it and just is indifferent. Last year, there were two major Iranian military figures who, and I wrote about this, who called for Israel to be wiped off the map. Germany's response was to term this rhetoric, again, to wipe nearly 7 million Jewish Israelis off the map. The German foreign ministry and the federal government, Chancellor Angela Merkel, both said to me, this rhetoric is merely anti-Israeli rhetoric. That was the quote, anti-Israeli rhetoric. So what is the functional equivalent of a second Holocaust for the German government is anti-Israeli rhetoric. They would not, that is Merkel and her social democratic foreign minister, Heiko Maas, vehemently refused to call this type of genocidal anti-Semitism. They would not use the A word at all.
Ben, so we have about 5 more minutes, so people feel free to send in your questions. So Benny, how does this type of acquiescence to a very virulent and strong form of anti-Semitism square with the acceptance in Europe and of European countries with the IRA definition? How can they tolerate this form of blatant anti-Semitism?
Well, the Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which is a good definition, it's an outgrowth, as we know, of the famous Natan Sharansky definition, who's the chairman of ISGAP, who invented this notion that if you demonize Israel or delegitimize it or apply double standards, the so-called 3Ds, that criteria spells anti-Semitism when you meet that criteria in different ways, to give a very abbreviated version of it. So the Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance organization, adapted this definition, and for the most part. So there are some things that are left out from my perspective, but it's a good definition. It's it's not enforceable, as we know. It's not legally enforceable. It's used as guidelines for policymakers, civil servants, authorities, police officials, hopefully counterterrorism officials, when they're monitoring social media and electronic footprints, can use this definition to see if anything is out there about potential terrorists. I mean, both the terrorists in Germany over the last 6 months, in October and just a few months ago in February, were both radical anti-Semites, genocidal anti-Semites in my view, and there was, according to their writings. So you can use that definition. Obviously, you want something much more robust in terms of cracking down on anti-Semitism, because there's just widespread indifference among large swaths of the European society, and I don't really have an answer for that, except one, of course, more education. But you're dealing with other very deeply informed or ingrained anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic attitudes targeting Israel. I mean, one hopes you can decontaminate the population. I hate to use that type of rhetoric now because we're in the middle of the coronavirus, but I've used it before the coronavirus. And I think that's possible. There are other skeptics who think the anti-Semitism is so deeply anchored among so many people in Europe that anti-Semitism is largely incurable. But I do think there's there are countervailing movements, or countervailing trends, I should say, not movements, to combat anti-Semitism.
Okay, Benny. So on that note, we're going to wrap up your presentation in this important presentation and conversation that you led. And I really appreciate your insights and all the work that you're doing and have been doing for decades, and continued strength and success in all your very important work. And thank you for taking the time, as always, to join us. We really appreciate it. And I just wanted to say, I've been looking at the names of people who have joined us on the webinar, and there's a lot of old friends and colleagues, so I'm glad you're listening in. I just wanted to let you know that next week, on April the 13th, Monday, April the 13th, we're going to have a session dealing with anti-Semitism and the coronavirus. We'll have some good colleagues. We'll have a panel with leading scholars, and IRA and ISGAP will send out notices. So we'll have that on April the 13th. And we're starting to put together a seminar series that will be announced in the next few days. Fiamma Nierenstein will be speaking, David Patterson, Lorenzo Vadino, who's an expert on Follow the Money, Amy Ellman, that looks at issues of gender and sexuality and anti-Semitism, she'll be speaking. So we're going to have a whole group of people over the next few weeks leading conversations and trying to bring together a community of scholars and activists and community leaders, policymakers who we're all kind of alienated, bring us together and have some conversations, and to try and keep these issues growing and going. And I think, with the time that we're living in, we need to be aware and cognizant of some of the challenges that I suspect will be emerging, and it's sort of in a very rational, scientific way, try to grapple with some of these issues. So Benny, thank you once again. Ira, thank you for putting this together again. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. One other thing, Charles,
yep.
As I mentioned, the links I sent over, and if anyone else wants any additional information, they can email me at, I'll type in my email as well.
Ira's been actually, as you've been speaking, he's been circulating it.
Hours.
Ira's been circulating it to everybody on the call, so everybody has your URLs, and Ira can send around your.
Oh, great. Thank you, Ira.
Okay, so everybody, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you next Monday.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a Hag Sameach, and stay safe and stay well. Be well.
Bye.
Thank you.